Good morning. Welcome to Emerging Technology Conversations. And today we have a very distinguished guest and a guest interviewer as well. So two guests. That's pretty exciting. Our main speaker for today is Dr. Alexis Hero Weeks. I hope I said that correctly. And we also have our guest interviewer, Lindsay Hercule, who is a director of compliance, a lawyer specializing in data privacy. So that connects really well because Dr. Weeks is a distinguished data privacy expert, senior global leader in data privacy regulation, cybersecurity, and data protection controls. His expertise spans information technology, risk management, data protection, audit, governance, and healthcare compliance. That's a lot, Dr. Weeks. I'd like to ask, how did you get into the realm of cybersecurity and data protection?
So I would say I started about maybe 10, 15 years ago when it wasn't really called cybersecurity. It was more business continuity at the time. So when I started to kind of map out where the industry is going to go long term, and I started looking at opportunities to be able to add value to companies, data privacy just kind of fell in my lap in that sense. So I kind of looked at where the market was going and then long-term strategies in terms of data, right? I understand at that point that data was going to be a huge impact to organization and the ability to be able to protect that. Also, when I was back in UE a couple of years ago, I started to look at, there was a fundamental paper that I read, a pivotal paper that became part of my dissertation that looked at the implication of data privacy regulation around the globe. So at that time, it was around GDPR. So within the US, there is multiple states that have data privacy regulation with no federal implication within the US in comparison to like the GDPR. So from a state perspective, they've been going through that cycle. So being able to more or less plan ahead and think ahead in terms of where the industry is going to be, that's kind of how I kind of fell into data privacy and data security.
Wow, that's super interesting because I think cybersecurity is one of the most talked about issues in the world right now. And we, with the advancement of artificial intelligence, I think it's just going to grow. Tell us about how you think this sudden surge in AI, affects cybersecurity.
So I think, AI is highlighting some of the same weaknesses that we've always had in cybersecurity. I think today it's exacerbating it in the sense that because AI is able to think a lot more faster than a human may think now, based on the data set that's readily available, I think the opportunity for us to be able to find more holes much quicker. So AI will provide us the ability to understand where those weaknesses are in real time. So that becomes a very significant impact on cybersecurity itself. So what is happening is that individuals are not following basic cybersecurity hygiene. They're not patching. They're not addressing the risk. So with AI, imagine having the ability to look at all options, being able to scan your systems and find all your weaknesses real time, even and including to 0 days, right? That you as a practitioner or an organization may not know. So the AI is just going to make that, I wouldn't say worse, but I think it's an opportunity to be able to use it on both sides. There's an opportunity to use it defensively, and there's an opportunity for it to be used by perpetrators or adversaries to find weaknesses. So as practitioners who's in the business of compliance and risk, it is our opportunity to not only leverage the technology, but being able to find how we can get that balance between the outcome that we're looking for, which is to protect our organization, while using the best available technology that exists.
And what would you say is how do you think countries other than Western countries are coping with this change? I know Lindsay wanted to ask some questions about the Caribbean.
So I think, for more Western countries are what they call more MDCs. There have been a push over the last couple of years to modernize infrastructure and being able to extend services online. So when you look at it from a cybersecurity risk perspective, we see many people who are failing when the systems are on-prem, now being able to move to the cloud. So the exposure for those organizations, I wouldn't say who's technologically advanced, but from an application and system perspective, they've been able to move a little bit faster than the rest of the world, which means that there is more ways and opportunities to find risk in those systems because they're online. So the more, like one of the colleagues in my network always say, connected equal hacked, right? So any system that are connected provide an opportunity to extend those services to customers while also exposing you to more risk. And because of the whole online nature of the modernization in some countries, their exposure is a little more higher. In other countries where it may not be as depth in terms of cybersecurity itself, they're still being impacted. What it means is that some of the infrastructure, because they're offline, they may not be as exposed as some of the other ones that are online from a more developed countries, if you look at it from that perspective. However, the implication can be very dire for those infrastructures that is not developed, right? So individuals might be taking stuff from a cost perspective. They may not have inadequate resources to be able to, hire a professional, make the type of investment that would be required to protect your infrastructure. And that in itself puts you at risk as an entity because, technological knowledge may not be there. You may have systems that may not be supported anymore. There may be inherited risk into some of the infrastructures that you may have because you're not able to modernize as quick, or you may not be able to react to like a 0 day, for example. So in those instances, there's a dichotomy between the haves and the have-not in that sense. However, even the have-nots may still have some advantages because the risk exposure may be a lot less than, what we'll consider some of the modernized countries.
That's really fair. Thank you. That actually really opens the door to really having a better understanding in terms of, like you said, the haves and haves not, but also too understanding the limitations and challenges that a lot of emerging countries, may have when it comes to like, this whole new phenomenon around cybersecurity, data privacy, and now the use of AI and how that's implemented. So I guess my one thing I definitely would love for you to speak about is really looking at the regional aspect of things, right? So when we look at, for example, when it comes to technology, it's usually looked at it on a more regional perspective when it comes to emerging countries like the Caribbean, the Americas. So I guess I wanted to understand is just like, how do we kind of address uniformity when you have so many different layers of economies and cultures, and these very various dynamics, but yet there is this expectation of uniformity across when it comes to looking at technology and innovation and how to implement protective measures. So I think I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of like, it's hard, like it's just interesting how it's easy to, or I guess we've been taught to see these regions as one rather than individuals, right? And then there's this expectation that, like, the shoe should fit for all. So how do you kind of break that down and really kind of ensure a level of protection that's both respective of the culture of these individual cultures, whilst at the same time having that commonality towards that goal of ensuring, greater data protection or that greater sense of protection overall?
So I think, one of the differences that you'll see when you look at it at a regional level, I remember when I did my research looked at the implication of data privacy regulation and consumer disclosure decision. Whether if you have more information, would that result in you taking less risk as it relates to who you would share your information? I think we have to dissect it from the fact that in some regions of the world, privacy and cybersecurity is like a fundamental right. So if you look at in Europe, for example, privacy is built into what they do in terms of the way of life. When you compare the US, for example, is more sectorial. Even when you look at Brazil at one point was similar to the US from a more sectorial approach, and they recently start moving toward a fundamental approach as it relates to how data is actually protected. A lot of it has to do with the resource and your capabilities within those regions. Because in most of the regions, they tend to have, I wouldn't say like a cookie cutter approach, but it's like a shift and lift. When we look at the Caribbean region, for example, Jamaica has a privacy regulation, Barbados have a privacy regulation. But the challenge is when you compare to what you have in Europe and the ability to enforce some of those things, even when you look at it from a GDPR. GDPR is only enforceable if you have entities operating in the US, in EU. If that way you can kind of put controls on the operation for those entities. Most of the big technology ones from the US operating in EU. They have the ability based on their site, 300 and something million plus users, from a market perspective to try to clamp down and say, hey, there's cultural differences, there's specific things that you're going to align to that is unique to our business. When you go to a smaller region, you're not going to have that enforcement ability, right, to be able to institute. There is also differences in the mindset as it relates to organizations, or the region may think, I'm too small. Who's going to attack me, right? But we've been seeing an uptick in that over the last year or two. Multiple organizations in Trinidad was hit. During the COVID period, the immigration services in Jamaica was hit because you had to upload all of this sensitive information. There are many regions, there's many countries within the regions actually have regulations on the book. In St. Kitts, where I'm from, have that in the book. There's no supervisory authority that exists to be able to enforce that. So the ability to enforce some of the fundamental rights that you would see that they can do in EU is different across region, even when you look at it in Africa, right? You have the same approach because in South Africa, they've been doing this stuff around sensitive information for many years, right? Nigeria has their own, Kenya have their own that recently came on board. So there's a process where many regions are following what we call, the 300-pound gorilla in the room. And that is because of how, structurally it is actually set up. What we are seeing over the last couple of years is that an adoption at the local level. What does privacy mean for my people? How do you identify what you consider sensitive information? PII is PII regardless of whether you're in Australia, South Africa, or in CKIS, right? Once you have those kind of standardized classifications. Many of those regulations is coming out of the 1974 regulation in the US and the ODC stuff in the 80s, that many of these organizations had agreed to be part of that at the global level. Even though GDPR may have came into effect in 2019, there was regulations before that. So it's just the whole formalization of that across the block, so everyone have a standard language from which we are speaking. At the regional level, I think there is a lot of opportunity to adapt. There is many frameworks and standards across the globe that an organization or country can follow. And you may have the ability to use a blueprint from another region, and then you may just adapt it to things that may be unique to you. In Africa and other places, there may be cultural differences and things that you may want to protect. From a legal perspective, everything is based on law, right? Law from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, where organizations have come back and they're going to argue based on those treaties and different things that is established. But regionally, I think the opportunity to strengthen that, the skills exist. It is learnable. And then you have many people who's in the diaspora from those regions who are expert, who have the capability to be able to reach out and have that conversation with entities or organizations. We try to do that for CARICOM. Last year I had a conversation with the regional SSS organization looking at like cyber crimes. How do we address that across the region? Many of it have to do with resources. If you don't have the resources to be able to invest in that, there is multiple agencies that can provide services. United Nations have stuff, European Union and other organizations help some of these regions to be able to develop their economy. It's like banking, right? When you think of banking, it's like a two-edged sword,
right?
Because there is challenges where the region is trying to grow up, as they would say, but other mature regions have been doing it for a long time. So what they may consider bad in one region, they have already mastered it. But the ability to be able to to kind of formalize what is expectations. And the risk is the same, like I was saying. So you're either going to have controls or you're not going to have controls. You're going to have a baseline to look at risk, but then you still need to determine that which needs to be protected in your region.
Right. So, and thank you for that, because that was a lot in terms of like really navigating, the different levels of how we view regulations and how it's then, how it can be implemented, I should say, whilst also having to acknowledge, like you said, the regional differences, the cultural aspects of things, and really how is that then integrated, right? When it comes to really looking at, data privacy and cybersecurity overall. As you had mentioned, I know that the EU had recently, just enacted their EU AI, right? So which is huge, right? And then so we kind of look at that, and then like you had mentioned the GDPR, but then there were of course other regulations prior to that. Obviously, the EU AI is something that I know is very quite talked about. And I guess for me, I want to hear your thoughts about what is your opinion about it, and is that something that could ideally be replicated or at least amended to really now be seen, or at least being enacted within these regions as well, like given the fact that they are, yes, of course, its own limitation challenges, but what does that mean for these regions?
Well, AI fundamentally is going to change all industries. When you kind of look at the technology and where it's driven, there is twofold. There's the benefit of the technology and your ability to be able to accomplish, many things that are redundant in terms of tasks. So there's robotic automation, there's application within healthcare to be able to read large data sets and help with better outcomes. I think what EU was trying to do is that the regulation tend to move very slowly. If we see it with data privacy as well. So getting out ahead of the technology before it is really matured, like AI is not new. AI is new for the general use and the general public. I remember last year hosting a conference, and one of the speakers was addressing the fact that OpenAI and the multiple things around ChatGPT and generative AI were supposed to be released around 2030. But there are many organizations that's been using automated decision making for a very long time. So the technology itself is not new, but general applicability of the technology is new. So with them, if you look at some of the fundamental rights within GDPR around automated decision making, it aligns with that, because the expectation is that they're trying to tie that the decision should be made by human, even if you have AI involved with that. So we're seeing application in like talent and HR, where they're being able to, find that diamond in a rough kind of when you're looking for a candidate. But the challenge is fundamental to any AI system is the underlying data set on which it is built.
Yeah.
So imagine, no matter how good the outcomes are, AI and cybersecurity becomes a reflection of society. Yeah. So a lot of the stigmatic stuff that you have that's systematic within culture and within the society is built into those. So if you don't have representation, whoever is developing the set, what you have to train the AI on is the same data set that have errors and weaknesses and misrepresentation of individuals. So when you go through that, what you need to do, even at the regional level, is as you adopt these technology, you have to start building your own data set that's unique to your region, your people, and also bringing in your culture in order for it to be effectively used for your region. So it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all.
Thank you. So for what you're saying is that each region culture should develop their own database, but to build a whole open AI themselves, I think that's a little bit too difficult. So are you saying that they should take a data set and then adapt it, like you were talking about the legislation before, and adapt it to their culture and country?
Well, I think the ability to build the data set itself is not expensive. What is expensive is the whole collection process of that. So some researchers, for example, may use open source systems to be able to start building data set. there is also some data set that has been harnessed over the last couple of years that may properly represent multiple type of people, culture that a region can take and then start building on top of that set. So when you start looking at what the outcomes would be, it would be closely aligned with the specific region from which it's going to be used. So that you're not really starting from zero. The challenge is that if you take a data set that reflected in the US and now adapt that data set to train algorithm in Australia, there's going to be a difference in terms of the cultural makeup, things that may be different, in social norms that may need to be factored in, that may be different from the US compared to Australia. So being able to adapt that, then the ability to, if you have the technology and Health and Human Services or other government entity that's already been collecting data may have some of the demographic information that they've collected as well. Because even in the US, when you look at data set that was collected by NIST and other systems, if you look at how some of those systems were collected, it was just crazy. And one of the things that we're seeing in research today is many of the same organizations are trying to fix the issue by maybe going out. There was one research that I was recently listening to that was looking at the whole process where a provider went and started collecting information from homeless people by taking pictures and capturing that information just to diversify their data set. But when you think of it from an IRB perspective, from a research perspective, there is whole protectionism around certain category of information and individual that you can utilize and whether consent is actually obtained. There was an organization that ran into some issues a couple of years ago that was just crawling the internet and capturing multiple images. There was an Australian who was actually behind that organization who kind of...
I apologize on behalf of Australia.
Yes. So, so the challenge with that one is if you just call the internet and you're not using like a peer review on other places, the type of information that's going into your data set become questionable. And if you're going to question the underlying data system which AI decisions are being made, you got to be able to use it either with an asterisk or something to be able to say, hey, there may be some outcome that we may not all agree with, but we're just starting. And what do we need to do to kind of make it right and get that initial baseline?
It's so complex. Can I, just before I'll hand it over to Lindsay, my thing is education. So do we have enough educators to teach the next generation about this? And then, how do we motivate the next generation to actually be involved or start learning about technologies, especially in countries where technology is not, the big thing that everyone's involved in.
So I think one of the benefits that we have of the internet is the fact that the ability to learn is more readily accessible to the average person compared to, like I would say, my generation when we were growing up. You had to go have a library card and go and get a whole encyclopedia Britannica to go find information that may not be updated as frequent. So even in some of those countries that may not be as developed, I think the opportunity to use technology is amazing. Because they have the ability to see what Western countries have done and not have to make the same amount of investment and obstacles that they did. I remember going on safari and I was looking at lions, but I had 5G. Right? And if you look at it from the perspective of, because it's a developing country may not have that, you would not provide some of the opportunities and think that they're not able to make the kind of advancement that we do. I remember being able to go on the street and there was an application called M-Pesa when I was in Kenya. And you can buy peanuts from the lady on the street and you can actually send her that $5 immediately.
Oh yeah, so in Asian countries
the
is the same.
Development is there. One of the things that I see is not on the Western side, we find a lot of opportunity to do not the most productive things with the technology because it's so readily available. But the ability, like you were saying, Debbie, education is going to be key. And your ability to adapt and prepare the future leader for this industry is going to be amazing. So, we got to start early. We can't wait until individuals get our age to kind of get into the technology. I think one of the benefits that I've seen today is that the younger generation, they are more adept than when we were at that age. Our kids say, hey, Dad, you're old now. And they're doing so much more on these systems than when we were kids. So I think what we are seeing is that we need professionals who have that expertise to be able to go back and do some training, but also involve the younger generation in that training as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I was definitely going to piggyback off of that. So thank you so much, Dr. Alexis. I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that in many different ways, it's easy to kind of dismiss, these like emerging countries when it comes to technology, but if anything, they're very much in a sweet spot, right? Where they are learning from like, our our own mistakes and how we implemented it, but also too, it's used in a very wiser way because it's utilized out of necessity. So that fosters more creativity. But I'm also curious to kind of hear alongside the education, like you said, in terms of like the younger generation, they're living it. They're living the very thing that we're studying. Can you speak more in terms of like consumer behavior? I know that's part of your research is the willingness of consumers to provide this information. Again, you have the younger generation who's readily, I don't want to say they're readily providing it. They're smarter than we are because that's pretty much their daily use, right? I grew up in the era where you couldn't use your phone and be on the internet at the same time, right? Or there was dial-up.
I remember that.
Yeah, dial-up.
So I remember all of that. So it's a phenomenon for me, right? But I do think that in terms of like, but there's a lot to say about our behavior and how it drives so much of information that's available. I know you had mentioned like part of your research was about, consumer willingness to actually either disclose or withhold their PIIs. And I just want to hear your thoughts in terms of like, how exactly is this? How does the process work? But also too, what does it mean for a lot of these countries where it's quite undermined, but their data is actually probably even more valuable than what we have here? So I would love for you to really speak on that.
But yeah, Lindsay, that was an interesting question. And I think from my research, I think one of the things we need to understand is we're in a different time. So I think the generation today, they're growing up having social media. They don't know what it's like to not have social media as part of their life. So there is an inclination to want to register everything that they try to do. Even when I did my research, I look at the demographics between 18 all the way to like 65. And they look at the differences in the disclosure decision based on age group and also based on culture, which is one of my pivotal papers or instrument that I used at the time. So I think when we look at the generation today, I don't believe they understand the value of data, right? So as an older generation, we're always thinking, okay, how is my data might be used? But the younger generation may be up to that. And then they may also have the notion where they're like, so what if my data is used? It's already readily available and everyone is doing it from that perspective. So I think from a disclosure decision, one of the things I try to point out in my research is that if a user is properly informed about the practices of the organization that they're going to be interacting with, and they have to make the decision to share that information, whether they may consider some of those additional factors, how the data is collected, how it is processed, how it is shared, and how it's actually used, right? So being able to make that determination, I think it's difficult for someone who's always growing up and it's there. It's like valuing the sun if all you've had is sunshine in the region that you live. But then you go to Alaska or in other places that may have, sunshine half of the year based on the way you may be in the world, you may have to live at night and being able to adapt from that perspective. I think what is happening today is the technology is becoming so open and there is this willingness to share and connect. So, one of the top social media organizations in the world have always spoke about the idea of trying to connect people. Now, as a privacy professional, the first thing that I say is if you're not paying for a service, you are the service, right? So when you start considered how data is being used by some of these entities, you have to kind of make the determination of whether you want to use that service or not, or whether the value of the data that is being shared or how it can be shared is imperative to your ability to adapt and utilize those services. So there is a decision that many individuals are making today that they may not see the implication or the effect of it right now, but when you think of the long-term implication for some of the activities and action that you do, you're being able to see that. So even when you look at it from a talent perspective, imagine you're going to an organization to apply for a job and they ask you for your social media information. What would they see or not see that is there? Or some organization that have specific policies governing what you can do not only in the office, but what you can do in social media that could get you fired. Sometimes your opinion may be your opinion, but when your opinion have the connotation of working for the president's office, right? Or the prime minister's office, it's not just Debbie and it's not just Lindsay making this comment. People associate that with the organization you may work with or the ones you affiliate with. So there's implication on a lot of those things in terms of your ability to disclose. And one of the things I try to show in my research is, I believe in the notion that, right now there's this fight between access versus ownership. As a data privacy practitioner and an advocate, I am more concerned about you as a customer owning your data. Because if I can establish ownership based on legal and requirements around that, there is an obligation for you if you as an organization use my data. So that's the difference is when you start looking at many of the same social media and organizations today, they're more interested in providing you access. I am more interested in you being established as the owner of that data. So that if I'm the owner, I can determine what you can do and not do with my data. The challenge is that because privacy is not a constitutional amendment in many places in the world, the ability to go back to law becomes a challenge. Because even when you look at the research, it goes back to looking at stuff from comparing the property, right? Property in itself, from a legal perspective, establishes your ownership. And you can determine what is done or not done. Even when you look at it from a US perspective, you may have the Fourth Amendment that talk about unreasonable search and seizures, but that don't apply if you're at the airport. It don't apply once you come into the country. If you go to a country and they say they need you to provide access, otherwise I'm not letting you in, they may have the ability to search those devices. So the ability to share that information become a fundamental thing that if you're not mindful what you have, that may cost you later. So from a customer perspective, I think as we get better as a society to be able to educate customers, we need to let them know how the data is collected, how it's being processed. Many of these organizations have privacy policies that is driving what they can do or not do. Right. Except those policies can be changed anytime without the customer consent. And it's clearly written by attorneys. Sorry, Lindsay, to say that, but it is written by attorney to protect the interests of the businesses and not necessarily the customers. And we, as customers, eventually give away so many rights that we're not even thinking. Because think about it with AI today. You walk into an institution, you provide service for a specific purpose. Organization may later come and say, I'm going to use Debbie's data to try to get better outcome. Now I'm going to have AI start running over that application and implication of that data, but that was not the original intent or the purpose for which the data was given. So now you're looking at secondary usage of that data without properly obtaining consent. So as a privacy advocate, that's one of the areas that I'm interested in. I'm interested in your use of my data and the boundaries that I can set around how that data can be used and the duration for which you can keep it. Most regulation look at the whole concept of data minimization, right? The intention is to only collect data that is required using like a least privilege and only keeping the data for as limited as is needed. You're not going to keep it for 10 years if you only need to keep it for 3 years. And after the 3 years come, you need to have a process in place to get rid of that data, right? But today, in the generation where everything is just being harvested, because an organization may think about how would I use it later,
Yeah.
and that's the intention.
So, and then
I'm sorry.
oh, sorry. Sorry, I was just gonna ask, I mean, as you're probably aware as well, is that the US on a federal level is now they had a pretty much a draft bill, the America's I think it's what's it called? The America's
Privacy.
Privacy Rights Act.
Yep.
So, and I think it speaks a lot of what you have just said. And obviously, we're still in the draft session, right? And there's still quite a bit that's going to continue on with this discussion. But I think it's exactly what you're saying in terms of like really finally I know there have been previous attempts to actually really address a lot of these very key critical issues that you had mentioned. But I think that, there's a actual start given the fact that number one is bipartisan, but number two, there's so many different supplementary regulation that really speaks, like for example, that really looks at how do we ensure that kids are protected, their information's protected and whatnot, when it comes to obviously their active usage. So that's something I think will be quite interesting to kind of see. But I think that one of the questions I wanted to ask, with everything that you had mentioned in terms of like your role, your advocacy, and what you actually your view on data privacy, is that what the Research Institute, CyberMinds Research Institute, is that what you practice? Like, how does that work as a think tank? How do you really kind of ensure that that information is out there? How do you ensure that people are not just simply just hearing it, but they're actually really truly listening to the critical points of their actual data and how valuable it truly is, and what measures can be taken to really protect that?
Well, I think from a CyberMind Research Institute, I think one of the things that we're trying to do, we are more or less a think tank. So we're researchers who also have practical experience managing cybersecurity in a multi-billion-dollar organization, large enterprise in multiple fields. I think the introduction of the new regulation at the federal level in the US is interested in the fact that the sponsors of the bill are not running for re-election. So, and it is bipartisan in the sense that I think it's more of a reaction. So recently we had some situation whereby data brokers were utilizing the services of service members. So they always say when it gets close to you, you kind of feel the heat and it forces you to act. My concern, and some of the concern in the industry with the legislation right now, is the fact that the organization that is trying to push it, sometimes you have the folks on the same industry that is supposed to regulate, trying to be a part of that. And within the US, because the federal level override the state regulation that exists, states like California may have some challenges with it, states like Illinois that have a BIPA, which is the Biometrics Information Privacy Act, that protects individual usage from that specific state, may have some concern with it. So in the US, unlike some of the places that we've seen, I remember in 2018 when I was in the EU having a conversation about GDPR before it come into effect. One of the differences you have in that region compared to the US is that the lobbying and data brokers are very strong on this side. They're not going to go sleep into the night and allow regulation that's going to directly impact their business. So they have an interest in being at the table to kind of craft that legislation and influence the outcome of some of those organizations. So from a CyberMinds, what we try to do, we try to be that practical experience where we can bring the information about how it's done practically and also bring it from a research perspective in terms of where the industry is today, how does it compare and where it's going to go in the future. And we are thinking that as users become better informed, they may make better decisions based on information that is shared. What I'm concerned with at the federal level is, in its current state, like I said, it's only discussion, so it hasn't gone through full committee and been voted on yet. There is always the implication that the federal regulation will become weaker than the one that we have for the state. Yeah. So, from a US and how the laws work in this country, that's always the concern. Because you may have some state that have a strong regulation, and if you have a weaker one at the federal, that's going to take precedence, and that may impact some of the ability to implement consequence for the protection of data.
So politics plays a huge part, doesn't it? I was going to say before, the idea of transparency, a lot of platforms now are starting to look at showing where they got their answer from, like showing where the data has come from. And I know in the Scandinavian AI policies is a huge emphasis on trust and transparency. So what do you think about that? Because you can get, I'm assuming, I'm not really sure, but AI can get, if you ask it a question, they can get information from a lot of sources. So I'm wondering if that would just, block up the whole system if you're constantly trying to supply, the answers of where it came from.
So when you look at AI and how the LLMs work, what they try to do is look at predicting a combination of words based on the things that you would ask and what the response would be in terms of what they reply to. I think the Trust and Transparency Acts in the Scandinavian regulation, it is important because you need to know kind of where that data is coming from. I think one of the things that we've seen with this adoption in AI, and it becomes like a side effect or a drawback of the technology, is that they take large language models. It needs a lot of data to be able to put things together. And one of the things that we are seeing, sometimes we just make stuff up. Right?
Yes, hallucinations, I think they're called.
Right, so that's the hallucination, and then the whole idea, well, there is the whole notion of data poisoning, where there is a whole process around individual feeding fake data to some of these LLMs in order to kind of, break them down or make them fail. So that's one of the risks that when we start looking at data in terms of the way you're looking at. So I think your source and the transparency of your data in terms of where you're getting that data set is going to be key. And that goes back to the question that we had before around how was the data set created on which the language models and everything this set up and the AI is now training. So being able for you to come out and say, here is where my data sources are. The challenge that you have with the technology is that it's moving so fast. Like even when you have open AI on other systems, they may come and say, okay, you're using this to create information, you've collected my information. Okay, I'm not going to use your information now going forward, but it's already been trained on it. Can it be untrained? The same thing with Google having some issues recently around image generation, where individuals are now coming and say, hey, you're using my IP work to create stuff. There was a use case where some of the images from Disney was being generated in not a nice light. Right? And there was a whole uproar of how Cinderella was being presented. And that's a whole IP and the protection of that types of data set. And the question is like, Disney's not going to authorize anywhere for their characters or stuff to be presented outside of that control set. And what happened is that many of these AI systems, they already start doing it. And then they kind of come back later and say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not going to use that anymore. So, which is why we are seeing it across the globe, where many practitioners and advocates are advising customers as creating primary content. Think of music, right? And if you have a proper prompt, you can go and tell the AI, create this music that sounds like Debbie. So let's say Debbie was a famous singer in Australia and had been recording for 20, 30 years. Being able to say, okay, craft this song using melodies that was similar to what Debbie may have done in this one album. And the AI having that information now create a song that sounds so similar that somebody hearing that song must think, oh, Debbie must have released a new song, only to realize that it's not really Debbie, and it may have sampled information from Debbie. The record industry, is not gonna put up with that, because there's a lot of stuff around IP and the ability to get royalties that is now being challenged by some of these AI systems sampling information. So some artists that gets maybe pennies on the dollar if you use their music. Imagine if they have millions of these artists' information being used and they're not properly being compensated, right? And then you're generating information using their content. So even in the patent office in the US, we've seen implication where they've totally rejected images and paintings and other things that was AI generated. Many industries, like I said, is being impacted, including the movie industry. Last summer, we had an entire strike by the Actors Guild, where individuals are saying, hey, we're not going to do this until we negotiate a contract, because many of the shows that you made from the 30s and 40s are now being remastered and sold to Netflix.
Right.
And the original people may not get compensated for their work. So I think from a transparency perspective, AI is going to force that conversation now that any content you're generating, if you don't have control around it, many of the system will just gobble it up and find a way to just kind of regenerate that information and then just repurpose it without showing consent or ownership around this material.
Yes, so interesting. I think we might wrap it up now, if that's okay. Any wise words of wisdom for the future, Dr. Weeks?
The wise word is, as a customer, be informed. Understand how your data is going to be used. There are opportunities for you to give consent, and if you give consent rightfully so, there must be the ability to withhold that consent at any given time once that is given. I think we need to be better aware about how we are online, what information we share. We need to be careful about that, how it is processed, how it is collected, and how it's being used. And the ability to establish ownership is what I would like to see most of the conversation be about, and less about access. But we still need to have fun. We still need to learn, but we still need to be able to understand, the AI, no matter how smart it becomes, it still needs people to run it. It still needs data set on which to change. If you remove all the data, there is no AI. So making sure that there is integrity that's done within the data set and representation is there is going to allow us to do a lot more things, because we'll have better representation across multiple cultures, regions, globally.
Thank you so
Enjoy
much.
the technology.
Thank you. And thank you, Lindsay, for being our guest interviewer today. I love your experience and background really made a difference to this interview. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.